The night he told a room full of investors that loyalty in his kitchen was priceless. I had 3 months of his own handwriting in my bag, proving he had never paid for a single hour of it. Let me start at the beginning. I arrived in this country with a knife roll, a culinary diploma from a school most people here could not pronounce, and the specific kind of hope that only immigrants carry, and the kind that is already seasoned with doubt. My name is Marco. I'm from a small city in the south of a country that people here associate mostly with sunshine and football. I'd been cooking professionally since I was 19. I'd worked in hotel kitchens, catering operations, private clubs. I knew how to break down a whole lamb in under 12 minutes. I knew how to feed 200 people from a kitchen the size of a parking space. What I did not know when I walked into Dietrich Haller's restaurant for the first interview was that some employers see a work permit application as a leash. The restaurant was called Haller's. Original, I know. It was a mid-range place in a good neighbourhood. Exposed brick walls, Edison bulbs, a menu that called itself modern European, but was really just German comfort food with a few capers thrown on top. Dietrich had inherited the space from his father, who had apparently run a simpler, more honest version of the same restaurant for 30 years. The father had a reputation. Dietrich had a logo redesign and a social media account. The interview lasted 40 minutes. Dietrich shook my hand twice, called me a find, told me the kitchen needed someone with real classical training, and offered me a salary that was slightly below market rate. He explained this as a probationary structure. After 6 months, he said, we review everything. He said it the way people say it when they have no intention of reviewing anything. I needed the job. My work permit was tied to employment. This is the part people who have never been immigrants sometimes do not fully understand. You do not always have the luxury of walking away from a bad deal. The deal and the legal right to stay in the country are sometimes the same object. Dietrich knew this. I would learn later that he made a habit of knowing it. I took the job. The first months were hard in the normal ways. New kitchen, new team, new rhythms. The sous chef was a quiet young man named Petros, Greek, also on a work permit, also careful with his words around Dietrich. The two of us developed the kind of alliance that forms between people who understand each other's situation without having to discuss it. We communicated mostly through the food, a nod when a sauce was right, a look when something was being sent out that should not have been sent out. I worked long hours. This is not a complaint. I've always worked long hours. Kitchens are not places for people who want to be home by 6. But there is a difference between working long hours because the work demands it and working long hours because someone has decided that your time has no monetary value after the 8th hour of the day. The overtime started small, an extra 30 minutes here, an hour there. Dietrich would come to the kitchen past just before closing, lean on the counter with his arms crossed, and say things like, the new menu launches Friday, so let's make sure we're all in early this week. The word "we" was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Dietrich was never in early. Dietrich arrived at 11, walked through the dining room straightening things that did not need straightening, had a long lunch at the bar, and left by 4 to handle what he called the business side. After 3 months, I was regularly working 55 to 60 hours a week on a contract that specified 40. I asked about overtime pay once, politely, in writing, through an email that I kept a copy of. Dietrich replied verbally 2 days later, in the dry storage room where he had followed me in a way that felt deliberate. He said the restaurant was in a growth phase. He said the team needed to show commitment during this period. He said he had gone out on a limb to bring me on, given my visa situation. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten me directly. He just placed that last sentence in the air between us and let it sit there. I nodded. I said I understood. I went home that evening, sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that I did not drink, and I opened a spreadsheet. This is the part of the story where people sometimes expect me to describe rage. I did not feel rage. I felt something colder and more useful. Clarity. I understood the game that was being played. I understood that Dietrich had done this before, probably to Petros, probably to whoever had been in my position before me. I understood that the only way to win a game like this was to play it very quietly and very carefully for as long as necessary. I started documenting everything. The spreadsheet tracked every shift, start time, end time, contracted hours, actual hours, the difference. I kept the physical schedule printouts that Dietrich's office manager posted on the kitchen corkboard every 2 weeks. I photographed them with my phone before they could be taken down or replaced. I kept every pay stub. I kept every email. When Dietrich started communicating his extra hours requests verbally, I began responding to them in writing. A simple reply email that said something like, confirming I will come in at 7 on Thursday as discussed. He never replied to these. He did not need to. The sent timestamp and the absence of contradiction was enough. Petros noticed what I was doing within a week. He said nothing for a few days. Then one morning before service, he handed me a USB drive and said, I have been doing the same thing for 8 months. His records went back further than mine. His documentation was, if anything, more meticulous. He had a natural gift for it. He had studied accounting before he switched to cooking, which explained the color-coded categories. We did not celebrate this moment. We just put the USB drive in my bag and went back to prepping the mise en place. The second layer of betrayal arrived in month 5. Dietrich hired a new front-of-house manager named Claudia, who was young, German, and clearly being positioned as the face of a coming expansion. There were meetings I was not invited to. There were conversations that stopped when I walked into the office area. And then one afternoon I found out, through the payroll system, that I had legitimate access to because I occasionally ran kitchen supply orders through the same software, that Claudia was being paid significantly more than me, despite having fewer years of experience and no equivalent professional credentials. This alone would have been infuriating, but it was what came next that crossed a different line entirely. Dietrich called me into his office. It was a Wednesday, mid-afternoon. The restaurant closed between lunch and dinner service. He sat behind his desk with the specific posture of a man who has rehearsed what he's about to say. He told me that the restaurant was applying for an expanded liquor license and that the process involved a review of all staff documentation. He said that during this review, certain questions had come up about my work permit status, specifically about whether my current role matched the classification on my permit. He said he was not accusing me of anything. He said he was just flagging it as something we needed to be careful about. He said the word "we" again. Then he told me that in light of this uncertainty, it would be best if I did not pursue any formal inquiries about compensation structures until the licensing situation was resolved. He said it gently. He said it like a favor. I looked at him for a moment. I looked at the framed photograph behind his desk. Him and his father in front of the original restaurant, both of them in aprons, his father's hand on his shoulder. I thought about the father's reputation. I thought about what the father would have made of this conversation. I said, "Of course, I understand. Thank you for letting me know." I walked out of the office, went to the walk-in cooler, stood among the crates of produce for approximately 90 seconds, and then went back to work. That evening, I contacted a labour rights organisation that I had found 3 months earlier and bookmarked without yet using. I sent them the spreadsheet, the pay stubs, the schedule photographs, and a summary of the conversation that had just happened, written down in detail while it was still fresh. They replied within 48 hours. They assigned me a caseworker named Vera, who had a calm, methodical voice and the specific energy of someone who had heard this exact story many times and was not surprised by any of it. Vera told me several things. She told me my work permit classification was in fact correct for my role. She told me the overtime hours were a clear legal violation. She told me the implied threat about my visa status during a conversation about pay was itself a documented pattern in labour exploitation cases involving migrant workers. She told me not to confront Dietrich, not to quit, and not to change my behaviour in any visible way. She told me to keep gathering. I kept gathering. The kitchen videos came next. Not surveillance. Nothing covert in a legally complicated sense. Just my own phone sitting on a shelf where I'd always kept it during service because I used a timer app for certain preparations. The camera happened to face the pass. Over the following weeks, I accumulated footage of the kitchen in operation. The hours, the staff, the work being done. And on 2 occasions, Dietrich walking through and giving verbal instructions about extended prep schedules that he would later deny ever making. I was careful. I was patient. I was, from the outside, exactly the same employee I had always been. Thorough, professional, quiet, reliable. Dietrich, I think, had concluded that the conversation in his office had worked. He seemed more relaxed around me. He started calling me his secret weapon again, the way he had in the early weeks. He did not know that his secret weapon had been sharpening itself for months. The investor event was announced 6 weeks before it happened. Dietrich was opening a second location. He had found a group of local investors, mostly wealthy people from the neighbourhood, who liked the idea of owning a piece of a restaurant the way some people like the idea of owning a piece of a racehorse, the glamour without the daily reality. The event was to be held at Haller's itself, a private dinner for 12 investors plus partners, with the kitchen producing a tasting menu that Dietrich had personally designed. He announced this to the team with the enthusiasm of a man who had forgotten that tasting menus are produced by chefs, not by owners with Instagram accounts. He told me I would be running the kitchen that night. He told me it was the most important evening the restaurant had ever had. He told me my performance that night would reflect directly on the opportunity he had given me. I said, I will do my best. I meant it. I intended to do my absolute best, just not entirely in the way he imagined. In the 3 weeks before the event, I met twice more with Vera. The documentation was complete. The case was solid. She had been in contact with the relevant labour authority and with an immigration legal aid specialist who had reviewed my permit situation and confirmed in writing that there was no irregularity. The implied threat Dietrich had made was exactly that, implied and false. The specialist's written assessment was now part of my file. Vera also told me something I had not expected. 2 former employees of Haller's, both migrants, both long gone from the restaurant, had been reached through the labour organisation's network. Both had experienced the same pattern. Both were willing to provide statements. One of them, a woman named Irina, who had worked pastry at Haller's 4 years earlier, had kept her own records. Her documentation overlapped with Petros's in timeline and matched the pattern precisely. I sat with this for a moment during our second meeting. 3 workers, different years, different roles, same playbook. This was not carelessness. This was a system. I said, what do we do with all of this? Vera said, we let him perform. The evening of the investor dinner was a Friday in early autumn. The light outside was the particular amber colour that makes European cities look like movie sets. The restaurant had been dressed up, fresh flowers, new candles, the good linen that usually stayed in the back cabinet. Dietrich was in a suit, moving through the dining room with the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed being impressive. I was in my whites, in my kitchen, and I was cooking. This is the truth. The food that night was exceptional. I made sure of it, not for Dietrich, for myself, because I do not know how to cook badly on purpose, and because the investors deserve to eat something real. I made a cold cucumber soup with dill oil and smoked trout. I made hand-rolled pasta with a rabbit ragout that had been braising since 6 in the morning. I made a roasted beet dish with whipped goat cheese and candied walnuts that Petros plated with the precision of a man who knew this was his last service at Haller's. Because it was. We had both already signed our new employment contracts elsewhere. We had not told Dietrich. The dinner went beautifully. Course after course, the investors were delighted. I could hear the murmur of approval from the dining room through the pass. Dietrich came to the kitchen door after the pasta course, flushed and pleased, and said, Marco, you're making me look very good tonight. I said, that's what I'm here for. He laughed and went back to his investors. After the main course, Dietrich did what Dietrich always did when he had an audience. He made a speech. I could hear it clearly from the kitchen because the pass window was open and the dining room was small. He talked about the restaurant's history, his father's legacy, his own vision for expansion. He talked about quality and authenticity. And then he said it, the line I had been waiting for, the line that I'd heard variations of before, but never in front of witnesses who were about to write large checks. He said, what makes this place special is the people. I have built a team here on one principle, loyalty, real loyalty, the kind you cannot put a price on. My kitchen runs on dedication and passion, not on clocks and contracts. That is what you are investing in. Loyalty you cannot put a price on. I set down my tasting spoon. I looked at Petros. He looked at me. Neither of us said anything. Dessert went out. The investors applauded. Dietrich came to the kitchen door again to thank the team, and this time he shook my hand in front of everyone, a long, performative handshake, and he said, this man right here is the heart of this restaurant. I said, thank you, Dietrich. Then I untied my apron, folded it neatly on the counter, and picked up my bag. Dietrich looked at the apron, then at me. He said, what are you doing? I said, I'm going to join the investors for a moment, if you don't mind. There's something I'd like to share with them. His expression did not collapse immediately. It went through several stages very quickly. Confusion, then the beginning of amusement, then something harder and more cautious. He said, Marco, this isn't the time for... I said, it won't take long. I walked through the kitchen door into the dining room. The investors were still at the table, wine glasses in hand, in the comfortable glow of a good meal and a convincing pitch. Dietrich followed me, which I had expected. Claudia appeared from somewhere near the bar, which I had also expected. Petros came through the kitchen door behind us and stood quietly near the wall, which I had asked him to do. I introduced myself to the table. I told them my name and my role. I told them I had been the head chef at Haller's for the past 11 months. I told them I had greatly enjoyed cooking for them this evening. And then I said, before you make any investment decisions, I think you should know a few things about how this restaurant actually operates. Dietrich said, Marco, I need you to stop right now. I did not stop. I placed a folder on the table. It contained a printed summary, a clean, clear, 2-page document that Vera had helped me prepare. It showed the gap between contracted hours and actual hours worked. It showed the corresponding unpaid wages, calculated at the legal overtime rate. It showed the same pattern for Petros. It referenced the statements from Irina and the second former employee. It noted the date and approximate content of the conversation in which Dietrich had implied that my immigration status might be at risk if I pursued compensation claims. It noted that this implication had been reviewed by an immigration legal specialist and found to be without factual basis. One of the investors, a compact man in his 60s, with the look of someone who had spent decades reading balance sheets, picked up the document immediately. He read it without expression. Dietrich said, "This is completely fabricated. This man has a personal grievance, and he is..." The investor held up one hand. Not rudely, just firmly. He kept reading. I said, "I also have the original schedule sheets, the pay stubs showing the discrepancy, and video footage from the kitchen showing the actual hours worked. These are available through the Labour Authority case that was formally opened 2 weeks ago. The case number is on the second page." A woman across the table from the balance sheet man had already taken out her phone. I assumed she was looking up the case number. I was right. Dietrich had moved around to my side of the table. His voice had dropped. He said quietly and intensely, very close to my ear, "You are making the worst mistake of your life. I will make sure you never work in this city again. I will call immigration myself and," I said, at normal volume, so the table could hear, "you just threatened my immigration status again, in front of witnesses. I want to note that, for the record." 3 people at the table heard this. I could see it in the way they looked at each other. Dietrich stepped back. For the first time since I had known him, he looked genuinely uncertain. Not angry, not calculating, just uncertain, like a man who has walked confidently onto ice and has just heard the first crack. The balance sheet investor set down the document. He said to Dietrich, "I think we need to postpone the signing until we've had time to review this properly." Dietrich said, "This is a disgruntled employee making false accusations on the most important night." The investor said, "I heard you. We'll be in touch." The dinner ended shortly after. The investors left in small groups, quietly, the way people leave when they have just been given information they did not want, and now have to decide what to do with it. Claudia stood near the bar looking at her phone, probably drafting a message to Dietrich's lawyer. Petros collected his own bag from the kitchen and came to stand beside me near the door. Dietrich stood in the middle of his beautiful, candlelit dining room in his good suit, next to the fresh flowers and the good linen, and he looked at the empty chairs where his investors had been sitting. He looked at me. He said, "Why?" I said, "Because loyalty that cannot be put a price on still has a legal minimum wage." I picked up my bag. I walked out. The consequences took several months to fully arrive, which is how consequences usually work in real life. Not like a door slamming, more like a tide coming in. The Labour Authority investigation was formal and thorough. The documentation was too clean and too corroborating to be dismissed. Dietrich's position was that the overtime was voluntary, that no one had been coerced, that the schedule sheets were preliminary drafts rather than directives. These arguments did not survive contact with Petros's colour-coded records, the video footage, or Irina's statement, which described an identical framing of voluntary dedication used to justify unpaid hours 4 years earlier. The back wages were calculated and ordered. The amount, when I finally saw it in writing, was larger than I had expected. 11 months of overtime at the legal rate, plus Petros's 8 months, plus the penalty calculations that applied when an employer had been found to have systematically withheld pay. It was not a fortune, but it was real money, and more importantly, it was mine. The investor group withdrew. All of them. The balance sheet man, I learned later through a mutual acquaintance, had done his own due diligence after the dinner and found that the Labour case was not the only irregularity in Haller's financial history. The family business facade, the story of the honest father's legacy being carried forward, did not hold up well under the kind of scrutiny that people apply before writing large checks. The liquor license expansion was denied pending the investigation. Without the expanded license, the second location plan collapsed. The photograph behind Dietrich's desk, the one of him and his father in their aprons, was apparently still hanging there when the licensing inspector came to review the premises. I imagine it looked different by then. Dietrich did not call immigration. This surprised no one who understood how these things work. The moment you have made a documented false threat about someone's immigration status in front of witnesses, making a follow-up call to the relevant authority is not a strategy that ends well for you. My permit situation was formally reviewed as part of the legal process and confirmed to be entirely in order. Vera's colleague, the immigration specialist, filed the relevant paperwork to ensure that the resolution of my employment situation did not create any gap in my status. This took 6 weeks and required me to sign several documents in an office that smelled of printer toner and instant coffee. It was the least glamorous part of the whole story. It was also the most important. I had legal security. For the first time since I had arrived in this country, the right to be here was not attached to any single employer's goodwill. Petros found a position at a Scandinavian-style bistro run by a woman who had worked her way up from dishwasher to owner over 15 years and who paid overtime as a matter of obvious principle. He sent me a message on the day he started. First paycheck includes Sunday rate. Revolutionary concept. I took some time before my next move. 3 weeks, which is a long time for someone who has been running on adrenaline and documentation for most of a year. I cooked for myself. I slept. I went to the market in the mornings and bought vegetables. I had no immediate plan for and figured it out when I got home. I drank coffee slowly, which I had not done in 11 months. I had saved money during the Haller's period because I had been living carefully, and because of whatever else was wrong about the situation, the base salary had been paid regularly. The back wages added to this. It was not enough to open a full restaurant, but it was enough to open something small. The place I found was a narrow unit on a side street near the University District, 12 seats, a small open kitchen, a window that got afternoon light. The previous tenant had been a tailor. The walls still had a faint smell of fabric and chalk that I found oddly comforting. I signed the lease on a Tuesday morning, standing in the empty room with my bag over my shoulder, and I thought about the walk-in cooler at Haller's, where I had stood for 90 seconds deciding what to do. I thought about the spreadsheet open on my kitchen table at 11 at night. I thought about the USB drive Petros had handed me without a word. I thought about Dietrich's hand on my shoulder, the performative handshake, the words, "This man right here is the heart of this restaurant." He was not wrong, actually. He was just wrong about whose restaurant it was. I named my place simply, with my own name and the word kitchen. Marco's Kitchen. Not glamorous. Not branded. Just accurate. I kept the menu short. 6 items that rotated with the season, a daily special, a soup that changed every 2 days. I made everything myself with one part-time helper, a culinary student named B, who had the same focused quiet I had recognized in Petros. I paid her correctly from the first day, with overtime tracked and compensated without being asked, and I showed her the payroll records openly so she could see that the numbers matched. She looked at me slightly strangely when I did this. I told her, "This is how it should always work." She nodded like she was filing it away. The restaurant did not become famous. It became regular. People came back. Regulars are worth more than reviews in my experience. A review is a moment. A regular is a relationship. I kept one object from the Haller's period. Not the spreadsheet, not the documents, not the USB drive, though those are archived in a folder in my filing cabinet labelled simply evidence. What I kept was the folded apron, the one I'd set on the counter that Friday evening before walking into the dining room. I had picked it up on my way out, without really thinking about it, and it had been in my bag with everything else. It hangs on a hook in the back of my kitchen now. I do not wear it. It is not a trophy. It is just a reminder of the specific moment when I stopped performing patience for someone else's benefit and started using it for my own. Some people who hear this story ask me if I regret not acting sooner. I understand the question. 11 months is a long time to document what you could theoretically have reported in month 2. But I have thought about this carefully, and my answer is no. Acting sooner would have given me a complaint. Acting when I did gave me a case. There is a difference. A complaint is something that can be dismissed, reframed, or outlasted by a man with a lawyer and a story about a disgruntled employee. A case with 3 corroborating witnesses, 16 months of documented records, video footage, and a formal immigration legal assessment is something different. It is something that does not go away when you want it to. Dietrich wanted me to be the kind of person who would either accept the situation silently or explode visibly. The first option would have cost me nothing, except everything. The second would have made me the story instead of him. I chose to be neither. I chose to be the person standing in his dining room on the most important night of his year, holding a folder, speaking at a normal volume, and letting the documents do the shouting. The last thing I heard about Haller's was that it was sold about 8 months after the investor dinner. Not to the expansion group, obviously, to a couple who turned it into a wine bar. They kept the exposed brick and removed the Edison bulbs, which I thought showed good judgment. I do not know what Dietrich is doing now. I find that I do not think about it very much. What I think about is the afternoon light in my narrow kitchen on the side street near the university. I think about the soup changing every 2 days. I think about B's handwriting on the prep list, neat and slightly tilted. I think about the moment each morning when I unlock the door and the smell of the previous day's cooking is still faintly in the air, and I breathe it in, and it is mine. All of it is mine. My name is Marco. I am a chef. I own my kitchen, and I have never once not paid overtime.